If you watched Nintendo's hour-long info dump about the Switch 2, then you already know that GameCube games are coming to the Nintendo Switch Online. Yeah, that's genuinely exciting news. But I think we're gonna save those games until a little bit closer to the system's launch. Instead, for today's episode of Review Crew, we're going to look at a couple of oddball 3D platformers from the 1990s that are being re-released on modern consoles. Namely, Glover and Croc, Legend of the Gobbos. Yeah, those are a bit unexpected, but are either of these actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Computer and Video Games, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Look, I know you were expecting SoulCalibur II, but try not to be too disappointed by this episode of 3D Platformer Review Crew.
There's only one hero who possesses the strength, the skill, and the courage to save the world single-handedly. Glover! Strength? Glover's got the magic and the moves to match big bad bosses. Skill? Glover's got the brains to solve mind-boggling puzzles. And talk about courage? Glover's got the to handle any challenge. Glover! For Nintendo 64 and PC CD-ROM, gotta love the glove.
You don't need me to tell you that when Super Mario 64 was released in 1996, it sent shockwaves throughout the entire games industry. It was not just a massive success, but also a sea change for what gamers expected out of their platformers. Given the high demand of the genre, it makes complete sense that pretty much every developer wanted to get in on the 3D platformer action. But with so much competition flooding the Nintendo 64, you really had to do something new and unique to stand out from the crowd. And that brings us to Glover, a weird little hero who is, well, a glove. Through a bunch of clever levels, the glove is tasked with getting a ball into the goal. Simple, right? Well, not so fast, because this 3D platformer has a real learning curve. With a Glover report now out on modern consoles from Cubite Classics, let's go ahead and see what the critics said about the Nintendo 64 version back when it first came out. As is so often the case, we find Electronic Gaming Monthly smack dab in the middle of the scale, with an average score of 6.25 out of 10. While that may sound low, it doesn't actually tell the full story, because there was a bit of a disagreement amongst the editors. Dean gave it a 5, complaining that, to me, this is really an annoying concept for a game. Learning to manipulate the hand and ball through Mario-like environments is like using chopsticks to eat soup. I'm sure the idea is to get really proficient, but I finally lost interest after futilely batting the ball against the side of a pool for 10 minutes. To me, it's another game that hides under the cloak of the kids game genre. Is it boring because it's for kids? Or is it really just boring? Crispin disagreed, going all the way up to an 8. Glover comes as a pleasant surprise, and not because it's one of those out-of-the-blue games that just happens to be really fun. This addictive hybrid is big on puzzle and exploration elements with a heavy dollop of Marble Madness plopped in. It all makes for a surprisingly deep game with lots of secrets and techniques to master, even if the steep learning curve throws you into the thick of things a bit too quickly. Now, EGM's score is right in line with what we saw from Next Generation, who gave the 3D platformer a middling score of 3 out of 5. That's the same score that you saw from Computer and Video Games, who agreed with a lot of Dean's criticisms. However, it was GamePro who ended up giving the lowest mark, a 2.5 out of 5. Let's not forget Glover's 5-fingered slap to the face to post-Banjo-Kazooie 3D platformers. Even the thick patches of fog can't disguise Glover's low-detailed textures, no-frills environments, and cliched cardboard bad guys. The weak visuals are complemented by a somewhat catchy but repetitive soundtrack, while very appropriate sound effects help solidify the excellent feel of the various balls. Glover is such a tedious game to play, it ought to come with a Surgeon General's warning. This product may cause frustration and boredom. While many were quick to write him off, Glover did find a few defenders back in the day. For example, Edge gave the Nintendo 64 a 7 out of 10, which actually isn't too bad for them. Nintendo Power went a little bit higher, giving it a 7.4 out of 10. I mean, that's not gonna win any Game of the Year awards or anything, but it's still respectable. And then there's GameFan, who absolutely fell in love with the unique hero, going all the way up to, get this, 92%. Ego, who came dressed up as a South Park character for some reason, gave it an 88%, arguing that you should not overlook this one because he's so cute that it hurts. There's actually a good deal of depth here, along with puzzle solving and platforming. Glover is hardcore, plus it's got Dennis, the blue bouncing bop bag. 3D platformers are a somewhat tired genre on the N64, but Glover's not just another clone. Bubba agreed. Ah, yeah. While you may take this puzzling platformer for no more than a simplistic Mario 64 ripoff, Glover proves to be one of the best Nintendo 64 titles to date, putting the smack down with some of the best interactive puzzles I've ever seen and insanely creative level designs with a flair for subtle humor. Put this one in a class all its own. The Nintendo 64 sleeper hit of the year, hands down. And Dennis gets Game Character of the Year. With scores ranging from 50% all the way up to 92%, it's clear that there's a lot of disagreement when it comes to the critics. Some loved it, while many weren't that impressed. Given the spread, it should surprise nobody that Glover earned an overall average of 67%. This is definitely an interesting game to go back and revisit all these years later.
There's a new adventure hero in games, Croc. Join Croc as he runs, jumps, swims, climbs, pushes, stomps, and jelly jumps his way through a breathtaking 3D adventure. Help Croc through 50 amazing levels as he faces hordes of villains and obstacles, from swarming sharks and giant bees to slippery glaciers and hot lava. Croc, Legend of the Gobbos. For PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and Windows 95.
From the moment that Super Mario 64 was shown running on the Nintendo 64 hardware, developers from around the world theorized that they could make a killing if they just ripped it off on the PlayStation and Saturn. I mean, think about it, the lure of being the PlayStation's Mario 64 was just too enticing for some developers. And that is, more or less, how we got Croc, Legend of Gobbos from Fox Interactive. Believe it or not, this was actually developed by Argonaut, who had just come off of working with Nintendo on games like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. They must have assumed that this would give them a leg up, because they went into the release of Croc incredibly confident, even going as far as to advertise this game as the Mario 64 killer. Yeah, those are strong words that seem almost impossible to back up. Let's see if they got any help from the critics. We're going to once again start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who ended up giving both the PlayStation and the Saturn versions the exact same score, a 7.5 out of 10. This is one of those rare times where everybody was on the same page. Craig summed it up this way: Croc is an amalgamation of elements from just about every popular platform game you can think of, especially Mario 64. Regardless, this cute game is good enough to stand on its own, even though it does have a few problems. My biggest gripes are that it's often difficult to judge your jumps in the 3D environments, and the enemies respawn after a few seconds. Despite its annoyances, Croc is one of the better PlayStation 3D platformers. Sean agreed, saying that some guys around the EGM office keep saying how Croc is just like Mario. Sure, there are a lot of similarities, but remember, this is the PlayStation here. And for Croc being on the PlayStation, it's a moderately fun and cool game. It has its share of problems, like loose control and jumps that are difficult to judge. But the graphics still look great. There's definitely no Mario, but but technically speaking, it's quite an achievement on the PlayStation. Now, for what it's worth, EGM was actually on the lower side of the divide. Only 2 English language magazines gave the game a lower score, with Edge going with a 6 out of 10, and Computer and Video Games agreeing, giving it a 3 out of 5. CVG summed it up this way: Fox is trying to suggest that Croc is the PlayStation's Mario 64, but anyone who's played both games for more than 10 minutes will tell you that the comparison doesn't do Croc any favors. Unlike Mario, which had all the power of Miyamoto's imagination on its side, Croc really isn't much more than an old-fashioned platformer that uses all the familiar cliches. Admittedly, PlayStation owners haven't seen it in quite this form, and you have to give Argonaut credit for the detail of the 3D environment, which looks excellent. Technically, it's a very accomplished game, and it does give the player plenty to do. Just don't expect anything genuinely groundbreaking. As we climb back up the scale, you'll see that most critics were in that 80% range. You had PSM give Croc a solid score of 4 out of 5. That's the exact same score that you saw from the official US PlayStation magazine in its very first issue. And just for fun, let's go ahead and check in with Saturn Power, who also gave the platformer an 80%. I'm finding this a very tricky game to review. At the heart of Croc are some really good, although completely unoriginal ideas, some beautiful graphical touches, and a large enough game for most of us. But due to the design of Croc's engine, the limits imposed by it have resulted in some decidedly limited gameplay. You wander through, collect a couple of gems, the odd Gobbos, and fall into the lava with increasing regularity, and then it's on to the next one. There's a few challenges, but sadly enough, most of the stages repeat the same old patterns. Croc is a very good attempt to replicate that Nintendo 64 game. But at the end of the day, you can't help feeling that the game should have a hedgehog in it and should have been developed by Traveler's Tales. Further up the scale, we have Entertainment Weekly giving it a B. Game Fan, who couldn't stop raving about Glover, ended up giving Croc a slightly lower score of 87%. Now, if you're looking for the top score, then that comes from GamePro, who gave the platformer a 4.5 out of 5 on both systems. That said, even with the highest score, they still had a few complaints. Unfortunately, Croc also suffers from familiar problems rampant in the genre: camera and control confusion. Inexplicably, pulling down on the analog controller makes Croc take a step forward to swing around in an arc, plunging him off the ledge if he's too close. Suicidal reversing aside, the highly responsive analog controller's the only way to go, and Croc's worth the learning curve. This game ranks as the best, most fluid 32-bit 3D platformer yet. Look, as a Mario 64 ripoff, Croc gets the job done. It doesn't break any new ground or even attempt to evolve the genre, which is probably the reason you were surprised when you saw that it was getting a remastered re-release. I mean, it's fun, but it's nothing special. You see that in the overall average, which comes out at a 77%. It's not the best 3D platformer on the PlayStation, but it was one of the first, and that counts for something, right?
飛んで走って潜って跳ねてやって楽しい見てかわいい 3D アクションクロックパウパウアイランド
メディアクエスト
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post episodes just like this every time classic games get added to modern consoles. We have a whole playlist with hundreds of these episodes. So I say give it a binge when you have a few minutes to spare. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's the most underrated 3D platformer? I don't mean a game that got all the highest scores and won Game of the Year and all that, but the one that everybody else was kinda iffy on, but you loved it. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back next week with a review of River Towns, which is absolutely one of the best games of 2025. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,